Everybody? Okay, we are ready to go. So in Sif Chaf Gimel, we are going to, I'm sorry, Chaf Beis. We're starting from 22. If you're following in the English one, it's on page 66. So number one, the Alter Rebbe says that the Eidim need to sign themselves. They can't act as a witness and sign when they themselves are telling somebody else to do it. So, okay, what do you already need to do? Some people didn't know how to write their names. Okay, that would be a common issue. A lot of people in the olden days were illiterate. However, there are contracts where people know how to write their names in English, but they don't necessarily know how to write it in Hebrew. And let's say they would be an aid for a get. So then they not only have to sign their name in Hebrew, but they have to sign it with a fancy feather. Let's see if I have one. A feather and a... Here, let me show you one. I actually have done this way too many times. You have to use a fancy feather. Sometimes when I'm a sofer for a get, so I have two different pouches. I have one pouch, which are the quills that I use for myself. And then I have a different pouch for quills I use for the witnesses. Why? Because the ones that I use for myself, I know, and I have like extra protection around them so that they don't get ruined. You know, I have double padded quills, turkey feathers, and I write the get. And then that I put in this one, okay? But then I have the ones, one second. I have the ones for the witnesses where they don't know how to sign as well. And you can see a mish kebab, a little bit of a balagan. This one is, I think, I use often. It's a nice one for a witness. And they sometimes have difficulty signing, especially if you don't know how to use a feather. So I don't think in any contract you need to sign with a quill feather other than a get. But that's one of the contracts that this halacha could be talking about. So sometimes the get is being done on the road, not in a place where you have a regular base, and the witnesses are kosher witnesses, but they are not necessarily perfluent in writing with a quill. So let's see, what does the Alter Rebbe tell us in Chaf Beis? He says the witnesses need to sign themselves. An aide that doesn't know how to sign himself, and then he tells somebody else to sign, and he gives him the quill, and he says, "Here, I can't sign my Reuven ben Shimon Chaim. It's going to take me 2 hours." I have seen witnesses where their hand was shaking when they were writing, like this. They're going to ruin the whole contract, which took an hour from an experienced sofer to write. So they're going to ruin the whole thing. Their hand is shaking. They're very nervous. They don't even know how to write it. So especially when the person is an older person and they are nervous. So they say, just you do it for me. Come on, please. And I've seen it many times where they've asked, you do it for me, but you can't. And that's the answer always is we can't do it for them. So don't think this halacha is some abstract halacha. It's I've seen it on a regular basis. So when the witness doesn't know how to sign, he can't tell somebody sign in my name. Why not? Because he himself is acting as the witness. The moment that he's going to tell somebody else to sign the name of this person, and that person is acting like a witness of a witness. And we can't use a witness for a witness. We can only listen to the witness himself. The Torah says, based on the mouth of the witnesses, we establish something. We don't establish something based on the mouth of another witness's mouth. So if Reuven ben Chaim can't sign his name, and he gives it over to Shimon to sign it for him, Shimon ultimately is as if saying, I am testifying that Reuven wanted me to sign for him. He saw everything, but he just can't. It wouldn't work. You can't have a witness testify on behalf of another witness. That we're going to see in the next subsection as well. Now, then the Alter Rebbe says, however, let's say you have some type of contracts where the person himself is, let's say he's getting a loan, so he wants to obligate himself on this loan. So some contracts, the person signs also on the contract. Like the chassan is getting married, so he signs on the kesuba. Some kesubas the chassan signs on, some don't. Sephardic ones they do. In Ashkenazic ones, it depends. In Eretz Yisrael, the Ashkenazic ones, they do sign it. The chassan, the groom, signs on it as well. In addition to the two witnesses, he's just acknowledging that the two witnesses are the ones that make the official document. And then the groom signs on it just so, yes, I acknowledge and I understand very well what the Edom have signed on, and I acknowledge it. So sometimes you have where the person himself also signs, or by a loan, or by a kesuba sometimes. So then, let's say he can't sign it. Could he tell somebody to sign in his place? So then that would work. That's okay. He's allowed to tell somebody else, and they can sign. However, the Alter Rebbe says in 22 on page 67 over here, if you see it here, the Alter Rebbe says that the two Eidim that sign on it need to clarify to the document. They have to make it clear on the document. They have to say that this is the chasima, this is the signature which they told us to sign on, and we signed on it, and that this person we are following, somebody signed in his name. So then his Alter says it's kosher. Okay. Now in 23, today I wanted to do 23 and maybe 23, 24, 25. We'll say 23 for sure, and 24 for sure, maybe 25. Alter Rebbe then brings down in 23 that the witnesses, this is a very important, why I had a terrible story that happened with this. Not with me, but a frightening story I'll share with you. Okay, so in 23, the Alter Rebbe tells us that the witnesses need to be very, very careful. He writes, Ma'od, Ma'od. Tzrichim ha'idim lizaher, Ma'od, Ma'od. They need to be exceedingly careful not to sign El Odavar Shirol Beineim. They had to have seen it with their eyes. So they can't, let's say Reuven lent money to Shimon, and he says the loan took place. So they signed because people told them that they saw the transaction take place, and now they're just signing. It's not allowed. They cannot sign on something unless they saw it with their own eyes. Very clear. Because Edus, testimony, is only what you see. It's not what somebody tells you over afterwards. And if they would sign on it, it would be like they're signing a false document, a lying document which is forged. Okay, so there can't be any, as the Alter Rebbe writes, any falsehood whatsoever in their testimony whatsoever. Okay, so now, and then the Alter Rebbe brings an example in the middle of 23 on page 67. He says, let's say somebody wants to borrow from his friend, and then afterwards, he gives him the shtar choiv, he gives him the document, the promissory note, and then says, look, the loan didn't yet take place. Take the promissory note as if the loan will be taking place. And then, Bezrat Hashem, you'll give the money over, and you see the valid document is as if it's all done. But at the end, maybe he didn't end up giving the money at the end. And meanwhile, he'll have a promissory note saying that he's owed money. So that's not okay. So we don't want to sign something and put a date on it and stuff if we didn't see that the loan actually took place. And the Alter Rebbe writes, it would be forbidden for the witnesses to sign on such a document. And in the footnote, they bring an interesting thing. They say a document is called a shtar amana, which means it's a trusted document. This prohibition, you can't trust someone and base it on trust. You have to base it on the fact. The loan took place, make the document. Now do the sign on the document. This prohibition applies provided the borrower did not perform a contractual act obligating himself, in which instance such a legal document is permitted, as stated in 17. Remember what we discussed last time? We talked about the ksuba, that sometimes the chassan will, especially the Chabad custom, is that they sign, they make the document, and they write the date on it from the time of when the chassan makes the listing of the thing. So let's say the ksuba was written at 5 p.m., and the wedding will only take place at 7 p.m., and night falls at 6:30. So if they write the date of 5 p.m., you could say that it was a predated ksuba, because it took place before the actual marriage took place, and he's obligated himself to something that he wasn't really obligated on. So The Alter Rebbe, so to answer the quandary that we had last week, how could a ksuba be kosher in such a way? So, and then we know that that's the general Chabad practice, is they make the kinyan and then they write the date. So the answer is, and that's what we're saying here, if they made a kinyan, then it would be fine. That means if they lift up a document, right? Not a document. He lifts up a. Let's see if I can share screens for a second. Let me just share screens for a second. So we explained that if the chassan, let's say, lifts up a handkerchief or a belt or something like that, a gartel, that's by a vart. That's not by the chuppah, but by the ksuba. There's something more. So I have a picture which is more accurate to that case. Like over here, where the chassan obligates himself the moment he makes a kinyan in front of the witnesses. So then, even if the loan didn't take place, or even though he didn't yet get married, but he has obligated himself to pay for all those things, for the obligations of a ksuba for marrying someone, so then it would be effective, even though the marriage didn't take place yet, merely because he made a kinyan. So then that would be fine. So if they saw a kinyan, then they could sign it. But if there was no kinyan, no acquisition, it would not be allowed. And he wouldn't even be allowed to keep the document in his possession, because there's a verse in Eov, in Job, where it says in chapter 11, Al tashken ba'alecha avla, don't leave in your iniquity to reside in your home, which means you can't have dishonest documents, can't have something which is not true. Okay, now fine, important stuff. Now I want to go to 24. This is it. Now this is the story that I said, oh, what a scary story that took place. So this is a story that I saw with my own eyes, and yeah, let's see what the Alter Rebbe says first, and then I'll tell you the story. In 24, it's on page 68 if in the English Sefer. So it says like this: the Eidim, the witnesses, need to be careful not to sign on a contract of a debt until they know that this is the person who they're dealing with. Imagine if, theoretically, you say, oh, hi, witnesses, can you come and testify? My name is Reuven, this is Shimon. I'm going to loan now $100 to Shimon. I want you both to sign. They go, okay, fine, yeah, fine. They sign on the document. They see the $100 being given. Meanwhile, this guy has a document on his hand. It says, Reuven gave money to Shimon, $100, and these two witnesses didn't even know him, signed on it. And guess what happens? That person who lent him money wasn't really the person Shimon. It was a made-up person, and he and his friend made a trick to have this document to try to make Shimon pay money. So, in order to avoid such a falsity, so they say that the witnesses need to know who this person is. You can't just take witnesses that they don't know who you are. So I'll show you one simple solution, what we can do in today's day, because often we're looking for kosher witnesses. Same thing with a ksuba. Same thing with a get. How do you know that you're marrying off this chassan whose name is such and such, and this girl who her name is such and such? How do you know that they're really, Reuven is marrying Sarah? Maybe this is a different Sarah, and they're just making some sort of false thing to make a contract. Sarah just wants to collect money against Reuven, and she never even met him. Maybe it's a trick. Or how do you know that Reuven is divorcing Sarah? Maybe it's just two random people, and I'll share you the story with that. Okay. So the Alter Rebbe says here that the witnesses cannot act as witnesses unless they know the names of the people involved, in order so there shouldn't be some sort of a game that's made between the two parties to try to rip somebody off. Now, and that's what's called a kanunya. A kanunya means a dishonest trick, a deceitful agreement. And you could do it with a loan. You say, oh, I am Reuven, this is Shimon ben Yaakov, and I'm going to lend him now $10,000. And he gives him $10,000. He takes two witnesses, they sign it. 5 minutes later, he goes back to his friend and says, yo, good job, high five. Now give me back the 10,000. Now we're going to go, and I'm going to go demand this person who you are impersonating to pay me the $10,000, and we'll split the profits or something. Yeah, that would be a disaster. So therefore, they need to know the person directly, so they know this is the right names of the right people. So one of the later comment, Ramosha Feinstein said you could also use what's called an ID. If you have an ID, that's also going to work because, preferably you should have people who know the person directly. But if not, you could rely on the ID, because the assumption is that a photo ID with, even if, it's possible, yes, somebody could forge an ID. It happens here and there, but people can forge a photo ID and make a name and put in a new picture in, but it's hard to do it. And it's unlikely that it would happen. So once we demand photo ID, that usually will help. I'll tell you a story. Oh, let me just finish one more point that Alter Rebbe brings here. If there was a renter, right, so he would need to know that this is the name of the lender. Because maybe, as they said, they made a trick. And so too by a sale. Let's say you said, I'm selling you my car, or I'm selling you my house, whatever, for this amount of money, or I'm giving this gift to this and this person. Okay, you need to know that the names are the right names and the people are the right people involved, so that nobody is ripping somebody off. Okay, but here's the mice. It was a story that I saw with my own eyes. Very scary story. So there was a get. Unfortunately, a lot of my crazy stories are with gittin, Jewish bills of divorce. So, some sort of noise outside. Okay, some sort of protest outside. Okay, I hope everything's fine. So, anyways, what happened was, there was a woman who apparently got a get, and the rabbi that did the get, he doesn't do gittin anymore. He got in trouble from the Israeli rabbinate. Anyways, so he gave them a document which said that this woman got divorced from her husband on such and such a date. And I saw the three, at every document of a get, they don't give the document, but they give a document that it happened. They don't give the actual get itself. Anyway, so on it was 3 rabbis signed. One of the rabbis actually today, unfortunately, has a pretty bad reputation. Okay, unfortunately. So anyways, what happened is that this woman provided that document. And now, this is years later, she's coming with her true husband. What happened? She had a get done by her husband 5 or 6 years ago, had 2 children afterwards. But unfortunately, that wasn't her husband who gave the get. He didn't want to give her a get for whatever the reasons. Unfortunately, they had some sort of a fight. So she went to some rabbi. I don't know the details, but she had convinced him. She brought some fake person to be her husband. So they did the get for her and for him. He handed the get. Beis Din apparently signed on it. It said she's been divorced through their Beis Din. And unfortunately, now she's coming 5 or 6 years later, maybe 7 years later, I don't know, with the real husband. He says, I never gave any document. I never did a get with her. Now she wants one for me. And this piece of paper was forged. Someone who was impersonating to me. And she admitted, she said it's true. And she cried. It was her Yetzer Hara, right? It was her evil inclination. Unfortunately, it was a very big affair. She even had 2 children. We don't know the status of those 2 children. That was another story. Anyways, so now she wants a real get. So now the question is, what went wrong? How did that happen? What made that this had to happen? So assumably, to Melamed Zchut, you could say that they just relied upon that she said it's her husband and they believed them. But honestly, if you come with photo ID and you have the ksuba, you demand them to bring a ksuba to prove that they got married with the marriage, with the chasuna, you provide that you ask them to bring a marriage license, to bring photo ID, then they wouldn't be able to trick all these people. So we don't know. I don't know the story. I know that unfortunately, the person who did that get was a not scrupulous person, and today
Rabbi,
he's no longer doing.
Rabbi, I have a situation now. I have a situation now, existing now in Israel, of a woman here from Pico that had been married to 2 different people. And this daughter that is in Israel, pregnant now, is out of wedlock daughter that she sinned with. And now she went to get married with a boy in Israel and she got pregnant out of wedding. What's the situation of her being a bastard child from her marriage, and what's the situation of the baby? Do we have any problem? Do we have any problems?
1 second. Question is, the main question is, was she married when she had children from someone else? That's the only main question. Is that yes or no?
Yes.
Great question.
She was married. She was married. She left the husband the house. She was not got divorced.
Okay, so we'll deal. I will be willing to deal with this question and help, but we have to speak afterwards, maybe tomorrow.
And her question is, what's the situation of this baby? She's 7 months pregnant with a.
Okay. Now. Okay. There is what to talk about.
That sounds serious. I'd like to hear too.
Well, the thing is, there is what to talk about, but I have to gather a lot of facts. Understand? I have to speak to her and get information from her in order to be able to. Let me put it this way: there are sometimes ways to find a leniency to. Not a leniency. There are ways to prove that the child is not illegitimate. There are ways.
Okay.
But it's not so simple. But the most important thing is to gather all the facts and to find
if you want,
excuses where
they're
maybe.
My next door neighbors. They're my next door neighbors. They are my next door neighbors.
Okay, well, let's speak about it. We can speak about it. That's a fascinating topic. I mean, it's a very sad topic, but there is what to talk about. Well, let's speak about it another time. Maybe if I do get in. Anyways, what I want to say is that if I do get involved in the case, I'll be happy to take details out and then show how to go around it. But if I get the information and okay, but it's a vexing question, and usually these questions they don't give a quick answer. In other words, we're not looking right away to. We don't want. Am Yisrael does not want to have illegitimate children if we can avoid it. We don't want. We will find any way possible to try to learn merit on the case, and we try. We really do.
Yes.
We have to get the details first. Anyways, we'll keep.
Continue in the safe.
I'll speak to you about that later.
Mayan, but just real quick, long story short, Mayan, it's a mamzer. Is that correct?
Yeah, it could be. It would be a discussion if the child could be a mamzer. Yeah.
I appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you
the mother.
Thank you.
The mother, but the grandchild is also.
Well, I don't know. I like I said, let me get the details later, and then we'll see what's the story with the case. Okay. Meanwhile, let's go back for a moment. Okay, so we said, bottom line is that photo ID is a tremendous important thing. So what I always do is, then the Alter Rebbe says that you don't have to have technically 2 witnesses testify that this is so-and-so. You could even have 1 witness, even an invalid witness, like say a woman, who says, yeah, I know this person, this is Reuven. And I know this woman, her name is Sarah, or I know this guy is Cheskel, whatever. And you could rely on that. The question is, why are you able to rely on a single witness to establish identity purposes? So the answer is very simple. The Alter Rebbe says, because any matter which you're going to eventually find out about, so people are not going to be quick to lie about. So if you have 1 witness to say this is so-and-so, you can rely on them. Photo ID would be in place if you don't have that. But you always want to get as much facts established to verify this is the person and it's not some imposter. Unfortunately, there have been cases like this.
And this is also
and that's one second. And that's what it says in 25. And that'll be the last one we're going to do today. that he says, if you don't know that this is their name, you can rely on another person, even an Isha or a Korav, even a relative. You're not allowed to take testimony from relatives. Relatives, we assume they don't say the truth, even if they are honest people. But we still are not allowed to listen to relatives. It's exeris akasif. But the Alter Rebbe says when they're talking about identity purposes, for this matter, you can rely on a relative.
I understand that this is, as we said, Rabbi Reichik said that this is what we declared a Jew, because the wedding is what bound them up, and it's the Davar HaMa'amid that is that witnesses. Now, the question is, the witness is the same thing, a Davar HaMa'amid, for someone to be Chazaka Kohen or someone to be Chazaka Jewish.
I'm sorry. Hear well. 1 second. Should make it a little louder. Say again.
I understand that the witnesses signing this document are creating another Jewish house, and they're the Davar HaMa'amid for the document. Without them, they are the main thing on that. Now, if a witness comes and says this woman is divorced, like you started, we believe them because he's a male. If it's not, it's a woman. But if the witness comes to say that this is a Kohen, or this person just moved into town, that he's a Jew, is there difference on the witnesses on level of Ma'amid?
Question. It's a good question. There are different rules for each scenario. Kohen, there's a machlokus, there's a dispute how you define somebody if they're a Kohen. In the olden days, you had to bring witnesses to prove you're a Kohen, 2 kosher witnesses. But in the olden days, they would eat truma in the Beis Hamikdash. They would have karbanis, and they would do all types of things which were not regular, for today. Let me just move. Sorry. Today, we do not have those privileges we give to a Kohen. We do give some privileges, like we give the identity of first Aliyah or something, but ultimately it's not major privileges. So today, if somebody will say they're a Kohen, we will take them at face value. However, it's very important that a Kohen, a person who's not religious and say they're a Kohen, you shouldn't be so quick to establish them as a Kohen, because as we know, a Kohen, one person he's not allowed to marry is a grusha. He cannot marry a woman who's a divorcee. And there's other types of women he's not allowed to marry. There's like a lot of different types of women he cannot marry. So we don't want to just quickly establish someone as a Kohen because he thinks his grandfather once said, that's something which is not. So if he does want to prove himself as a Kohen, the rabbi needs to fully investigate it to see that there's likeliness in what he's saying, because there are easy ways to lose your kahuna. There are ways that you could be born a Kohen, or your grandfather was truly a Kohen, but it's possible that the child could no longer be a Kohen. If
illegitimate marriage, mother or the kids.
There are ways that you could lose it. So the bottom line is that even if we could establish someone as being a Kohen, we don't necessarily want to do that until we have certain grounds to base that on, because it could be that it'll be very negative for them if they're not, if halachically they're not, and we're making them as one. So okay, that's another good point.
The story, yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, there's a lot of identity purposes where we don't necessarily rely on one witness, but at least for identity of something which will later clearly be revealed, then we will rely on one witness. That's what the Alter Rebbe says, because he says anything which is going to be revealed, we don't mind and we will rely. People are not going to lie. That's what the Alter Rebbe says. He bases it on a couple Gemaras, Rosh Hashanah, Yevamos. Okay. Then the Alter Rebbe says, let's say they make a kinyan in a contract for a loan. So then we would rely upon him if it's a shtar that has a kinyan, because we could write the person even without the lender there. Or somebody who is receiving a gift. If an act of contract is not performed, meaning they didn't make a kinyan, there is a possibility of deceit. For it is possible the other person is acting as the lender, and the borrower will not give the promissory note to the lender on the day it is written. Thus, the promissory note is predated, and the lender may use it to expropriate property unlawfully. Okay, so I think that's all I'll do for today. So the bottom line is that it was very important that people have to see the matter that they're testifying on and not just testifying stuff they didn't actually see with their own eyes. It's one thing, a hearsay. Hearsay is one thing, but seeing it is another thing, and you need to see it. And also, just in general, we need to know the identity of the people involved in the case before we quickly act as witnesses. We also learned in the first Sif 22 that you can't sign something. If you can't sign it, you can't ask someone else to sign it for you. That would be a problem. So there was a mice, I'll just tell you, with Moshe Feinstein, where he saw a get. They came down. All my cases were only Gittin, but this case I was not involved in, but I read it. It's a famous tshuva where Moshe Feinstein was the big posik of yesteryear. He had a get that was sent to him in New York, and it looked very strange because the writing of the get itself and the signatures all looked identical. And he looked at it carefully, and then he figured out that the witnesses were the signature of the sofer. And 1 second, if the witnesses were the signature of the sofer, it would be an invalid get because the sofer is not allowed to sign on behalf of the witnesses. The witnesses have to sign it himself. So he wrote a whole long tshuva, and the problem was that the husband was gone. They couldn't find him later. So if you can't rely on the kashrus of the get, it would be a big problem. So at the end, he found a room to be a matter. Again, it was a long tshuva, and I don't remember all of the details. But you know, the point I'm saying the story is because sometimes things might look that there's no solution, but if you go to the posik of the generation or so, sometimes they can find solutions for very difficult cases. Same thing in the case that you're mentioning, man. In other words, although face value, it would seem to be that like we would establish mamzeris based on some sort of story, but we're not quick to just do that right away. We usually have to consult and get all the details of the case, and then usually consult with the poskim of the generation to see if they find solutions, because we are not looking to create situations which will not be rectified in the future or cannot be rectified. Although sometimes if that's what the story is and that's the halacha, that's the halacha. But as I said, we're not quick to establish it. We try to have an expert based in verify the details and give a proper psak. And if there's leniency that can be used, they will use it.
As we learned 10 years ago with Rabbi Talber,